Tao of Clem by Robert Calder II. Tucked in between the salty haymakers of the Atlantic and the lush pine trees blanketing much of Cape Elizabeth, Maine, you'll come across the most charming little stretch of blacktop. Route 77, she stays within an arm's reach of the rocky coastline, but on occasion she'll snuggle up tight to the road's shoulder like a jealous old flame. Along the aptly named Shore Road, the sun blinks in and out from between the pines like film slipping the reel. It hypnotizes you, romances you, lures you closer towards an enchanted realm like the whisper of the siren's song. In a flash, you're whisked away from the lighthouses and tourist traps like a rumor on the breeze. And then, when Shore Road lists back lazily to the left, the path opens up to reveal the most breathtaking panorama cast down from the heavens. It's here where you'll find yourself among the mystifying, but don't blink or you'll miss it. Mindfulness and patience yield kindly results, and when the thick pine boughs twist back from the road like dusty old stage curtains, you'll feel like you've been plucked by the pinched fingers of destiny and dropped smack dab in the middle of the most heartbreakingly gorgeous seascape one could possibly imagine, one which commands you to pause, take a deep breath, and reflect as you bask in the glow of the mighty Atlantic. A beautiful view that is so humbling, so awe-inspiring, it's been said, it could make even the scurviest of sailors sage with envy. There's a second majesty, though, one which lies underneath the shadows of the oversized and undertaxed luxury-clabbered shacks which plague this stretch of priceless coastline like the sun-scorched barnacles littering a humpback's spine. It's here you'll discover a mysterious little cove, cold and slick with emerald seaweed, speckled in seagull droppings and glistening with salty sunsprites. Treacherous footings abound. The cove shields an even smaller crescent-shaped stretch of sand, no shorter than a proper dinghy and almost half as wide as a winter harbor seal. By appearances alone, you wouldn't think that this little cove would be of much significance at all. Quite frankly, and with all proper respect due to its marvelous backdrop, this dinky little cove hardly seems worth mentioning. But this is one of those moments in life where appearances can be rather deceiving. In fact, you may be surprised to learn that this tiny little stretch of beach is actually quite famous. That's a fact. And the reason why this cove comes so well regarded is because it is the birthplace and home of none other than bivalve extraordinaire Clement Copernicus Clam III, or, quite simply, Clem, as he's known among his most dearest colleagues and neighbors. It's also worth mentioning that you will never lay eyes on Clem, not directly at least. A disappointment for sure, but you see, Clem values his privacy. Very, very much. Rather than finding him entertaining guests, you're more likely to find him hidden away. Way, way, way out of sight. Deep down in the darkest and coldest sands he can possibly stomach. Down where the warmth of the sun can't quite reach. And because of that, neither can the rakes. For as long as he could recall, Clem had heard the rumors of how wonderful the world upside was, but they were just stories after all, right? Truth be told, Clem hadn't ever considered going above ground, you know. Upside? Not once. Perish the thought, no. It's a fool's errand, Clem would say, and far too reckless. In a way, though, Clem's reluctance to go upside makes logical sense. Seriously, just take a look at him for crying out loud. Looks kind of tasty, doesn't he? One might even say, good enough to eat? Picture it. Our hero, Clem, lying in repose atop a bird's nest of linguine pasta, baptized in lemon juice and garlic butter, as a squall of parmesan and parsley twinkles over him like a flurry. Fresh cracked pepper, you can almost taste it, can't you? That velvety feeling at the back of your throat as Clem slips down into your woefully empty belly with a satisfying plop. A chef's kiss from the ocean. You see? You see, that right there, that is precisely why Clem prefers to stay deep, deep underground, so very, very far away from the piercing eyes and the greedy influence of the upside. Ever since he was little, Clem had promised himself that no matter how he and the universe ultimately decided to part ways, amicable or not, it would never be on someone's dinner plate. At least, not if Clem had anything to say about it. That's because Clem considered himself to be somewhat clever. You see, Clem hadn't survived as long as he had by lady luck alone, good heavens no. Only the Irish can be so lucky. No, Clem's longevity was tied more closely to an ethos he followed very strictly. Clem believed that as long as he stayed out of trouble's reach, then trouble should never find him. So it was. Clem's survival instinct required he stay down, so very low, well beyond the reach of the deadly clam rakes and their bloodthirsty tines. Clem had heard all the horror stories from his father. Nightmare fuel carved into his brain by the knife's edge of his overactive imagination. Gruesome and horrific stories of murderous clam rakes and the gore-soaked trails of bloodshed and mayhem they left in their wake. Stories passed down from his father and his father's father and his before him, so on and so forth, all the way back to the dinosaurs. Generation after generation of the same family, hidden away deep underground, down where it's so very dark, waiting to pass. And if the universe should will it, they might return one day as sand, down there in the dark, slowly wasting away, but most certainly not on anyone's dinner plate. Clem had never seen a clam rake firsthand. Come to think of it, he'd never known anyone that had. Not that that meant anything. There's plenty of things Clem believed in which he'd never seen with his own eyes, and seeing as though Clem had no power over the whole rigmarole anyway, he was more than happy to show a little faith in the unknown, rather than worry himself sick over it. Quite as simply as that. Now, this isn't to say that living as deep as he didn't have its own unique disadvantages, because it most certainly did. Oh yes, it most certainly did. During his younger years, Clem found himself vulnerable to fits of loneliness and melancholy which would overtake him with the cold regularity of the tides. And just like the waning tides, Clem's sour mood left in its wake gritty flotillas of emotional jetsam, which collected over time, little by little, until one day Clem found that he'd built an entire mountain out of his fear and anxieties, and it was a mountain he was going to have to scale at some point, if he had any hopes of ever finding a soulmate. Which Clem did. He very much did. Clem's loneliness would ultimately draw him higher up in the sands like the wavy melody of a snake charmer's flute, up into the warmer sands, the very ones which scared Clem half out of his shell. But this time would be different, thought Clem, because this time he pushed his fears down, and he climbed upward despite their echoes. At first, Clem found the going slow, but as the sand underfoot grew warmer, he moved quicker, and with a newfound sense of optimism. But the higher he climbed, fear grew inside him like an oyster's pearl, layer by layer. Clem stayed vigilant, listening overhead for any sign that there may be a clam rake hovering just over the sand, its tines glistening, casting long, eerie shadows with its bloodthirsty fangs, and then the next thing you know, whammo, blammo, into the salted pot with poor old Clem. Cripes. It's a tale as old as time, and Clem knew it wouldn't be very long before something terrible should befall him if he didn't toughen up and get a move on. But that was just fear needling at him, right? Keeping him honest? Pfft. No bother. Clem tuned it out like yesterday's news and pushed on by love's sweet promise rather than fear's bitter regret. One day, Clem's persistence paid off when he happened upon the most charming and wonderful clam named Clementine. Clem fell positively head over heels for Clementine. Her personality sparkled like the stars, he'd say. Boy, oh boy, she really tickled him quite pink, she did. And from that day on, Clem's life would be forever changed, hook, line, and sinker. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be long before their first lovers spat. Clementine, you see, Clementine was an upper beach clam. She had needs, expectations, and on that fateful day, when Clem brought her back home, all the way down, deep, deep, deep in the darkest sands, well, let's just say that Clementine wasn't any too pleased. No, she wasn't pleased at all, to put it mildly. With a harumph, Clementine put her foot down. No, thank you, Clem, Clementine said. No, thank you. She remained polite, if anything. Listen, Clementine, my dear, just hear me out. I know you'd rather live up there, up in the warmer sands, but Clementine, let me assure you, this is all for the best. It's very safe here. Nothing can reach us here. There's never been a rake that could reach this far. Oh, no, Clem, Clementine said, surveying the land with a skeptical eye, her foot tapping faster. I'm sorry, but this just won't do. You can't possibly ask me to live down here, like this. I'm an upper sand girl, Clem. I have to live further up, you know, where it's not so sad, Clementine insisted. But the rakes, Clementine, what about the clam rakes? Clem moaned. Clem, I've lived in the upper sands my entire life, and do you want to know how many clam rakes I've seen? 0, Clem. That's how many I've seen. The clam rakes aren't real. They're just ghost stories, old wives' tales to keep us in line. Tell me, Clem, when was the last time you've met anyone who's seen one? Clementine asked. Tap, tap, tap. Clem knew that Clementine was making a valid point, and he couldn't think of a single soul he'd crossed paths with in his lifetime who'd ever seen one. And so it was, with his entire ethos deconstructed to rubble. Clem succumbed to Clementine's desires and moved them right away, up closer to the surface where the sand was much, much warmer underfoot. It wouldn't be long before Clem came to realize that living close to the surface quite suited him. In the almost up, he felt healthier, zestier, inspired. Not only that, Clem's overall mood blossomed like a spring garden, everyday feeling like wave after refreshing wave of satisfaction washing over him, cleansing his soul. Yes, sir, Clem and Clementine had carved out quite a beautiful little slice of heaven for themselves. Unfortunately, it would be a mistake to ignore that the universe, as with many things which muddle in the puddles of intellect and logic, craves balance. So it came to be one beautiful morning, as Clem was admiring how unseasonably warm the sand was feeling underfoot, from overhead came a rustling, followed by the heavy stomping of feet. Clem strained toward the sound, hoping to determine what it could possibly be, when, from out of nowhere, a cold steel tine ripped through his home like a guillotine, coming barely a muscle's hair away from splitting poor old Clem in two. Clem couldn't believe his fortune. For Pete's sake, he'd nearly died. Not only did what happened prove that the rakes and every horrible thing he'd heard about them were real, but one had almost just tore him in half. Clementine, Clementine, my love, Clem said. Did you see that? The rake? It almost got me. Can you hear me, Clementine? Where are you, my love? Please, speak to me. But Clementine wouldn't answer. Behind Clem, the soulless tines retreated from his home, wet sand spilling in behind them, erasing their violence. Clem watched heartbroken as his beloved Clementine, speared through the middle, impaled on one of the tines, was stolen away from him and likely to end up on someone's dinner plate. As you can imagine, this saddened Clem beyond belief. And it wouldn't be long before Clem grew despondent, sinking further down, deeper into the sand, deeper and deeper than he'd ever gone before. Clem wouldn't stop until he was certain he'd never feel warmth again, and he was well beyond the reach of the soulless teens. Over time, Clem's cloud of heartbreak settled into a low-lying fog of depression, until eventually the cold misery of the dark sands consumed Clem's every waking thought. And though he'd hate to admit it, during these sorrowful times the only comfort Clem could find was in crying himself to sleep. Why must I live like this, so far down? Is this all because of fear? And if so, what do I have to show for being so cautious? Solitude and loneliness? Clem wondered. That doesn't seem like much of a trade-off. There has to be more to life than this. And just as simply as that, Clem had found himself mired in depression's icy clutches once more, just as he'd been before meeting his darling Clementine. A hot wave of shame poured over Clem. All of his wallowing and moping, what good did it do? It certainly wasn't honoring Clementine's memory, was it? No. All his sniffling and bawling, it only seemed to make matters worse. No, Clementine wouldn't like that. She wouldn't want that for Clem at all. She'd want Clem to get up, dust himself off, get back to living, and give love one more chance. Wouldn't she? And so Clem decided right then and there that nothing would stand between him and his next bride. Clem abandoned most of his insecurities at home, only packing the ones he deemed absolutely necessary, and trudged his way back on up toward where the sand was warmer. Along his journey, Clem scoured the sands for his next love, looking under every rock and peeking behind the scrabbles of buried driftwood. But something about the process didn't quite sit well with Clem. Clem's problem, it would seem, was that it felt like he was trying to replace Clementine. But Clem knew better than anyone that Clementine was 1 in a million, and she could never possibly be replaced. Clem needed to look at it from a fresh perspective, but which one? Rather than overthinking it and risking a headache, Clem left the navigational duties up to his heart, knowing that eventually his heart would lead him to that special someone he yearned for. Clem searched high and low, repeatedly coming up empty, and his disappointment grew with each setback. It seemed like the universe had other plans for Clem, ones which didn't factor in his happiness. Perhaps this was Clem's destiny? And just as soon as Clem had resigned himself to the sour likelihood that the universe was completely and utterly against him, Clem happened upon the most breathtaking clam he'd ever laid eyes on. Her name was Cherry, and wouldn't you know it, Cherry stole Clem's heart away, just like that. Yeah, Clem sure did fall for Cherry, all right. He was over the moon for her. Quick as that, they wed. And as exciting as this was, Clem knew he needed to have a very uncomfortable conversation with Cherry, the very icky one concerning their living situation, the one that had haunted him since he uttered the words, "I do." You see, Cherry, just like Clementine, was an upper sand clam, the type of clam who preferred the finer things, the type of clam who required more than just plain old safety, but to feel free. "Please, Cherry," begged Clem. "My first wife, Clementine, she was like you, wanting to live close to the surface, and she persuaded me into it. But, and right there, in front of Cherry, Clem broke down into a blubbering mess. It took some time and a Herculean amount of effort for Clem to compose himself, at least long enough to explain, down to the last gut-wrenching detail, the horrible tragedy which had befallen him and his beloved ex-Clementine. He explained all of this, to his brand-new bride, Cherry. "Clem, please believe me when I say that I'm very sorry to hear about Clementine. I really am. What you went through, it's unimaginable. I can't even begin to comprehend the terrible heartbreak and sorrow you must have felt." But Clem, honey, that was Clementine. That isn't me, Cherry said, leaning in closer. And now that you and I are together, Clem, wouldn't it only be fair to consider what I want as well? Cherry went on to say, Clem, I'm so very sorry, but I can't possibly live as deep as you're asking of me. It's far too cold down there. So very dark, lonely. It's just so sad. Please, Cherry, I beg of you, Clem, knelt down on his foot. Let me bring you down for a little while. Let me show you how safe it is down there, and our love can keep us warm. At least try it for a little while, won't you? Pretty please? And if you find it to be as dreary and depressing as you claim, then we'll move right away, closer to the surface. Scout's honor, just not too close. And just how close is too close, Clem? Cherry asked. Clem didn't offer Cherry an answer. If it was up to Clem, they'd go deeper, down where the sand stayed wet, but that might be too deep, even for Clem. Instead of his answer, Clem offered Cherry a look that begged, Please, please, Cherry, just this once, just this one, and I won't ask for anything else for the rest of my life. And when Cherry saw that look, the sadness in his eyes, well, she buckled. What's it gonna hurt to give it a try? Cherry supposed, and quicker than you can say Clam's casino, Clem packed up all their belongings and moved them to a cozy spot about 1.5 feet from the upside, which still was closer than Clem felt entirely comfortable with, but that's what marriage is sometimes, Clem supposed, a series of compromises. Some days you trade a little peace of mind for a modicum of harmony. To Cherry's credit, she took the move in stride. When obstacles presented themselves, she turned them into opportunities. But even then, it wouldn't be very long before Clem saw it spreading over Cherry like an algae blanket, a deep, seeded yearning for something warmer, something pleasant. Clem wished he could give her both. For as deep as they'd traveled down, it hadn't dampened their bond in the slightest. As a matter of fact, when times grew darker and the coldness crept in like a draft, it drew them closer together. One pressed up against each other, growing stronger through their endurance. But karma works like a pendulum, and it swings both ways. Without regard for its target, as they say, and soon, Clem would watch on helplessly as a deep, profound sadness overtook Cherry like a red tide. It crept through her like a curse. Cherry became sullen, withdrawn, quiet. It had become clear they'd been far too deep for much too long, thought Clem, and now it was eating Cherry alive from the inside. Clem had to act, and fast. Right away he packed their things and moved them up another 1/2 foot, and before long Cherry's mood perked up a bit. She began acting like her old self again, bubbly and happy as a clam, just as the saying goes. But unfortunately, that persistent swing of karma's pendulum made its return with a weighty vengeance and the cold indifference of the executioner's blade, plunging Cherry even further into despair. I can't take it any more, Cherry, Clem said. We're moving back up to where we'd first met. Cherry, I need to get you all the way up, where it's warm. You're fading away right in front of me. But Clem, aren't you scared? Cherry, of course I'm scared. I'm scared out of my mind. But what scares me even more is that you've grown fragile. My love, you've grown as fragile as sea glass. Every day, my heart cries as I watch helplessly while the darkness snatches more and more of your light. I wasn't being fair to you, Cherry. I should never have asked you to move down this far. You deserve better. You deserve so much better than this. Please, Cherry, please won't you allow me make it up to you? Do you really mean it, Clem? Do you really? And Clem did. He really, really, really did. Clem, being a clam of his word, packed their belongings the very next morning and up they went. Clem happened to find them the most perfect little spot facing the Atlantic and put up stakes, tucked away not too far from up at all. A joyous new start. Cherry's spirits improved right away, like she'd never left. It took a little longer for Clem to come out of his shell enough to finally relax, but when he did, the relief felt like a tight belt undone after a great feast. Clem enjoyed being near the upside and its warmth much more than he thought he would. Clem grew to understand the sounds overhead, the rhythms of their beach. Like when the tide waned, he could hear the cars as they drove by on Shore Road. And when the waves thundered overhead, it was sometimes followed by the rhythmic pounding of the surfers' feet. Clem also found that his mood improved by leaps and bounds the nearer he got to the surface. The closer to the sun, it would appear, the brighter everything should become. One day, when the sand around him pleasant and Clem could feel the sparkly gold twinkle of gratitude fluttering all around himself like fairy dust, Clem turned to Cherry and spoke to her with genuine earnest. "I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, Cherry. If it weren't for you, I'd have never considered moving anywhere near the surface, and I wouldn't be experiencing this incredible sense of peace, which I do now. During the time we've been together, it's changed from the Clam I once was. For the better, I think. Everything frightened me, and I was too scared to live, and instead of facing my fears head-on like I should have, I crawled further and further away from them, hoping they'd leave me alone. But Cherry, it was you. You were the one that showed me why facing my fears and living near the surface is so important." Clem looked lovingly at Cherry. "Everything up here, everything and you, Cherry, it's all been so wonderful. It humbles me. Without you, I'd never know love's true majesty, and that her beauty, which exists in everything, is more than worth the risk." Clem's words left Cherry speechless. Her heart lit up like a lantern in the fog. "Thank you," she whispered, and she snuggled up close to him. That night, Clem fell asleep feeling more satisfied than he'd ever felt in his whole life. The next morning, when Clem woke, it was to the sounds of traffic in the distance, but what he didn't hear were the crashing of waves, which meant Clem shouldn't be hearing the pounding of the surfers' feet, but Clem was hearing footsteps regardless. These ones, however, were slow and deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. "Cherry, are you awake, my love?" "I'm right here, Clem." "Can you hear that?" "Overhead?" Clem asked. "Something seems fishy. Something isn't right." "Cherry, I'm getting a bad feeling, you know?" "It's just one of the surfers. Clem, go back to sleep. You worry too much," Cherry said, but Clem thought he caught a hitch in her voice. Cherry must have sensed it too. Something felt very ominous about those footsteps. Thump, 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 thump. Whatever they were, they stopped directly overhead, and the heaviness of the sand began to press down on them like an unwelcome obligation. What followed was the sound of an old man's racking cough, directly overhead, wet and heavy, full of phlegm, and when he spat, it hit the sand like a snare drum. "Cherry?" "Yes, Clem?" "Cherry, if this moment is our last, I want you to know how madly I love you." "I love you too, Clem. I love you dearly." Time stood still for a moment, deadly silent. The world held its breath. Then suddenly the tines of the old man's rake ripped through Clem's home, slicing a ragged wound the full length of Clem's foot. And, unlike last time, Clem wouldn't be spared the last breath of his beloved. The tines broke through Cherry's top shell, then scrambled everything inside it before crashing out her lower half without mercy or difference. Clem watched helplessly as Cherry, the very center of his universe, the pearl in his oyster, was stolen away from him just as mercilessly as his dearest Clementine had been. Clem, once again, left destroyed and crestfallen beyond measure, crawled back into the dark. Alone, terrified, scarred, and woefully heartbroken. That was 4 years ago to the day. For those 4 long, agonizing years, Clem wallowed in self-pity, hopelessness, and solitude. Seasons passed and the darkness overtook him, but still something within him glowed. Clem's heart yearned for the carefree days he'd spent alongside Clementine, and he wept for Cherry's sparkling personality and charm. But more than anything, Clem longed for the better version of himself, which both Cherry and Clementine made him want to be. He wouldn't stand for it anymore. Clem swallowed his fears, stuffed them down, and refusing to look back, he decided right then and there that he was going to the upside. He was going to do it in honor Clementine, Cherry, and himself. "I won't let fear dictate my life anymore," Clem declared, and he marched up. The higher Clem went, the lighter his heart grew. He was doing it, son of a gun. Old Clem was really doing it. And the higher he went, the warmer the sand became, and with it his happiness grew. Clem's heart beamed brighter than a lighthouse. Soon Clem heard all those old familiar sounds, the waves crashing overhead, the cars rumbling by with their throaty exhausts. Even the seagulls seemed to be able to find a bit of harmony on that fine day. "This is probably close enough. I should stop here," Clem said to himself. "There's really no need to go any higher. Nothing good. That's about all I can expect to find up there, and I'm already so very close. This should be close enough, good enough, right?" But Clem felt something in his heart. It gave him 2 quick squeezes. Thump, thump. Clem listening for footsteps overhead, but there were none. None apart from the gulls, of course, but they were constantly chattering. Ever curious, Clem climbed higher. The sand felt so much warmer here, it gave Clem the hopeful push he needed to coast through the rest of the way up. Clem stopped just under the upside, so very close, in fact, that he could taste it. It tasted of salt and smelled of pine, which meant he was very near whatever mysteries the upside held. "Well, Clem, old boy, this is it. It's the big moment. Are you ready to go through with this? You know, go upside? You seemed so sure of yourself earlier, but how about now?" "Well, Clem." Clem turned that question all over his mind from countless different angles. So many, in fact, he'd nearly forgotten the original question. It was becoming too much to think about. Clem got lost in the quagmire of variables and fear. So, instead of logic, Clem turned to reasoning. By his own count, Clem surmised that he'd had quite a few decent years for himself. And heck, who knew? Maybe with proper diet and exercise, he might just be lucky enough to squeak out a couple more good ones before the white sheet decided to bid him adieu. Clem was also well aware that if he let his curiosity influence him in the way it often did, it would lure him above ground, leaving him exposed, unprotected, naked. Even though Clem couldn't remember anyone who'd ever gone topside before and come back, he had to admit it left him curious. He'd always wondered what it was like up there. Wouldn't that be something, huh? Wouldn't it be something spectacular if he saw with his own eyes what really took place up there, overhead, on the upside? Clem felt a twinge run along the scar on his foot. What would Clementine do if she were in his shoe? Clem thought. For that matter, what would Cherry do? Those were precisely the words Clem needed to hear at that very moment, even if he told them to himself. With what remaining strength he had left in his shell, Clem made one final push through the surface. He felt the sensation of falling upward for a brief moment in time before landing upside down on the beach. For the first time in his life, Clem felt a cool ocean breeze whistle across his shell. The sun felt warm and inviting, like a nurturing mother. Nothing between Clem and her glory. Clem felt it shine on him. "This is amazing," Clem said. Everything around him had suddenly come to life, bursting with feverish energy. The upside was so vibrant, so bright, it was spellbinding and new. A lump rose in Clem's throat. I did it, son of a gun. I finally did it. Here I am on the upside. Holy moly, Clem thought. I've seen it, and it's so breathtaking, but dangerous. I should probably turn back right away, right? But Clem wasn't fooling anyone, most of all not himself. He'd come so far from where his journey had begun, it'd be a shame to not see it through. Clem knew this already. He knew it from the very moment he'd tasted fresh air. There would be no going back. And if that means the sun will dry me out like yesterday's seaweed, Clem said, well then, so be it, I guess. Let her have her way with me. Universe, if you're listening, I humbly offer myself over to you. Overhead, 2 gulls circled lazily, their shadows casting thick circles around Clem like paintbrush strokes. Squawk, squawk! Breaking formation, 1 gull swooped in, snatching Clem up in his beak, and climbed up higher and higher towards the clouds. In the seaweed rushing away from Clem, the gull droppings looked like constellations. The world unfolded in front of him, land and ocean stretching beyond his conception, each unfolding of the map revealing another lifetime of exploration. The universe was so enormous, beyond anything Clem could have possibly believed. It made Clem feel alive, bewitched. Heck, if Clem lived another 5 years, he'd never come close to catching this feeling ever again. Wouldn't Clementine and Cherry be so proud of him if they could just see what Clem was seeing, feel how he felt? The gull opened his jaw, and Clem teetered on its beak momentarily before spilling out, and for a second, Clem floated. And when he started falling down, faster and faster, Clem became more and more terrified than he'd ever felt before. But truth be told, it excited him just as much. Gravity pulled him straight toward the rocky shoreline as the seaweed spatter constellations rushed up to meet him. And when Clem splashed down, his shell exploded like bone china fireworks, leaving Clem naked and exposed in a small, wet gray pulp. Before the first gull could claim his prize, the other swooped in and swallowed him down whole. That would be the last Clem would embody that vessel. A little while later, after the gull's stomach had leached all the last nutrients from poor old Clem, what became of him would splash down in one last foamy salvo, speckling the emerald green seaweed with its own universe. Over time, the waves of the Atlantic would wash what remained of Clem off the rocks and into the sand, where he'd be welcomed back like an old friend. Over time, leaching back into the sand, where he'd be absorbed into the next generation of clams. Maybe one day that generation will take their own journey, facing their own doubts. A generation asking similar curious questions like, what is life like up there, up overhead anyway, up there on the upside? And wouldn't it be something if someday, when faced with their own problems, they might ask themselves, what would Clem do? The end.